Well, Uachtrain, Kiad Faltrot, Dean Nangan, is an old word doing a fat of a Norlaw. Darvu stocha a massa hagot a vele, a homalishin Darvu a massa hagot a fobble no galtan so.
Garamil Maut in a rerequin Jones and down or a shenangni kushagas. Nis Lord hug me quarter and called Credva Sagas on made the any palliative with the Gamma Wicca Slobas and Firkin Fortune, there is Chevron, August Ramavan, Kayla Side in the tSíthigh attached to love. When Johas are a Magoni Castle, winter and Goethe, Sharmar, and Gail Gefein of Akato, she bin Silier of us. In our rear equipment, soft. In Omiakla, Dini Elia, then when she did Mechana Fui session, Galan, well, we'll go to Corpagina Countess, and we'll get stitches. So, perfect.
Na de chini mi dort mar uacht ramsto halwa mi na chehelat fish fel sonacht bin fire agus funne verbuntat chud kaint goni agus tan chehesin a reintle leis an daurus diani wit. Reclaiming the European Street, Speeches on Europe and the European Union, 2016 to 2020. Of course, the speeches cover a pivotal and a seminal period. When we eventually look back at this period, it will stand out as a tumultuous period. Trump, COVID, climate change coming to the fore, Brexit. And it's a wide-ranging book, covering many aspects of today's greatest challenges. What struck me when you see the compilation as a single volume is the conviction and the consistency of your messages throughout, focusing on aspects of ethical economy, climate change, migration, equality, social equality. But before we dip into the book itself, I'd just like to talk to you a little bit about the art of speech making and speech writing, how you approach it. And I've always noticed that you seem to associate word with action. I'd like if you could maybe talk to me a bit about the power of word.
Well, first of all, I think in relation to the period that the book covers, 2016 to 20, there's one other word you didn't use, and that's the A word, austerity. I was actually responding to what I regarded as a very poor version of economics and a very shallow kind of economic theory and preparation that led Europe to respond to what was a global crisis in a particular way with particular effects. But to your question directly in relation to words, I remember Václav Havel giving a speech once, and it was the speech, I think he gave it, curiously, it was at a festival in Germany when he was getting an award, and he said, words can liberate, words can kill, words can free. It was about the power of words themselves. And I was struck by it at the time, and it came back to me very often when I was giving speeches too. And it's one of the curious consequences of social media now that it has created a new dimension to this problem. And that is that traditionally in writing in newspapers and so forth, you took responsibility for the word, the choice of the word, the use of the word, how the word fell and its consequences. One of the worst aspects of the worst version of social media at times is that people are firing words, which can include words of hate, out into the system without taking any moral responsibility for how the words will fall. And therefore you're doing it with, in my view, in a way that is at best amoral and quite often very injurious. So words matter. You asked me about it in relation to speeches. I'm very much struck by the effect of the delivered speech. I've written very few poems since I became president, but the one I'm happy with, one of the ones I'm happy with, is the poem I wrote for Mary McPartland, who died, with whom I had done some work, and it was about it was called Of Saturdays Made Holy, and it was about preparing to go and protest with all the banners and so on. And then the talk as you went along, and then the speech itself and the effect of the words and your response, and then going home and rolling up the banners for another day that they would come out, as I said, another Saturday made holy, you know. But in a way, that's so different. During COVID, I've given now maybe 170 pieces on electronically, including to the United Nations, the ILO, to different groups, Samaritans and others who had conferences that they needed to go on with. But it took actually more work because I have to have a finished product. But what I missed was the interaction. And I've been at it all my life, for God's sake, and for so long. And it's a marvelous test when you're on a stone wall. And way back at the end of the 60s, when it's equivalent when I was thinking about a speech I was giving in Connemara, and there was 3 stages of acceptance. First, would they stop at all? For this red man on Fartar. But then the point about it, my next thing was, would they cross the road after that, they said. And then the next part of it, would they stand near you but say nothing? And as somebody put it, a man whispered to me one time. But then it all changed. We got going with each other, as it were. But it's a fine test. That's a test of your words when you're on the stone wall.
I was talking to you earlier, Uachtaran, about your visit to Ethiopia, and I was fortunate enough to cover that visit. And I remember we visited Tigray. It's a war-torn region at the moment. And we went up into this valley called the Gergera Valley. It took 2 flights to get up there, you might remember, a UN flight, and then it was a 2 or 3 hour trek on dirt tracks and jeeps, and it was into this lovely fertile valley. It opened out before you when you came over the pass, and the fields were alive with people. It was like walking into a scene from the Bible. Cows pulling plows, horses pulling plows. But I remember the speech you gave to a gathering of farmers there was quite informal. Some of them were squatting around on the clay in the middle of the village, and you opened the speech. You had a translator beside you with the line, "I was reared on a 4-cow farm." And straight away, you could see the whole gathering sit up and take notice. You managed to connect immediately. When you're preparing your speeches, what significance do you place on that element, the audience or the gathering that's before you, and striking the right tone?
Well, it's a form of intimacy as well, and that it makes its own demand. On the question of the cows, by the way, it is interesting that it's one thing I think I wrote in one of my poems in the first collection. I make mention of this, the connection, for example, between your forehead and the udder of a cow. But of course, that'll tell you immediately I'm pre-milking machine. But no, I remember the other thing is that in County Clare, and that was a very warm part of my life, and people had names on their cows, and people knew you'd have so many cows. And I remember writing, it probably would be somewhat exotic now if you're an audience of sophisticates like this, to say about the distinction between milking a cow and a heifer, because a heifer is challenging. But you'll have to go back to one of my poems to find out the full story. But no, I do very much. I suppose when I was teaching at university as well, and this is a huge issue now, because people have had to do things during COVID, and you can do it by distance, and it was just the only way you could convey information. But there's a big difference between conveying information like that and having a relationship with a large group of students, as I would have had. I taught first-year students, and I taught then smaller groups of 20 at the university. But you enter into a relationship, and what you're not just flogging out information, then the same information again. You're engaging with their right to exercise curiosity, and you're trying to make complex things in such a way that they can be shared in discourse. And that's the part of I very much enjoyed my time teaching. I very much enjoyed also, I enjoyed speaking when I was a campaigning politician. And then I was involved with so many, from the anti-apartheid movement to my time in Central America and others. But you'll know, and there's one word that comes through this book, which is the challenge to the future of the Europe, and why I picked the title, Reclaiming the European Street, and that was the word authenticity. My sense about it is that the public will know what is a bit of language that satisfies the end of a meeting or an event, and something that touches what's worrying them at their heart, for example. And people slide into the acceptance of language at times that I keep challenging myself about. I say the inevitabilities, that there are no inevitabilities, that you must challenge false certainties. That's how, like, for example, I've made a brief reference to the question of the austerity. It came to be accepted that you had only a single model that was effectively a hegemonic market model. But what was to happen as the consequences of decisions fell on people in different circumstances on the street? And if they lose the connection with the language and they cannot perceive authenticity, and then you lose trust, and then they are at that stage in a large state of vulnerability in which people like homophobics, racists, others can exploit that vulnerability. And that's why in the book here, when I was speaking about, people talk about Schuman and the founding of Europe and Bonn, they're very important, but Europe is not about the coal and steel community. And I rescued, if you like, a document called the Ventotene Manifesto, which was written by Altiero Spinelli and Rossi when they were prisoners on the island of Ventotene under Mussolini's time. And they had a point about making a state that was equal, but then experiencing equality in such a way that you found it easy to see equality in other states' works and combining that. And I thought it's quite visionary in its relationship. They're principally concerned about eliminating the possibility of war. And I think it's very interesting in the way that we, in the international press, when I read it, is we spend so much time looking for an enemy. And really much of it is, in a way, into accepting a mind of militarism. Peace is far, far more difficult. And strangeness is what we have to accept about what is strange and then understood and so on. I refer every now and again, I think, in there to Theodore Adorno, and I say that I'm trying to avoid Adorno's depression. The way it works is Marcuse lightens Adorno's depression, and then Habermas comes after that, and then Hartmut Rosas comes there in a string of writing. When I look at that string of writing, for example, we're so indebted to the advances in science and in technology, now in COVID and the rest of it. But how is science impacting on our lives? The planet is in grave danger. And then maybe another repeated message that runs through much of what I'm doing now is saying that we have to have a different kind, we must teach economics differently, we must teach subjects connected with each other, so that, if you like, you get a kind of social economy that's able to deal as well as with issues of material things, that's able to deal with issues of social justice, and then that it has to be within a framework of ecological responsibility. And I popularise works like Ian Gough's Heat, Greed and Human Need and things like that. Now I've talked, that's mentioned, but they're all there anyway. But I owe a debt to these people because I use their work.
You talk in the book about the need to rebuild Europe from the bottom, and you look at both the introduction of legislation based on strong scholarship, but then you also look to the need for activism at street level. Is there not are they not contradictory, or do you envisage a kind of a revolution from both sides?
No, I think that it is one of the, you wouldn't get very far, you wouldn't sustain a significant change even on revolutionary principles if it wasn't informed by thought. In fact, one of the places where I'm looking at a book on the melancholy of the left, but it is anti-intellectualism is one of the great flaws that the left has at times, and that is that you get attracted into feeling a pressure to respond to what is perceived to be popular, and then you, in fact, lose the moment of offering the radical alternative that is available lying there in a kind of system to be born. And that's the hope in it all. One of the things yesterday when I was giving a paper on a different matter, I was referring to the people in this room wouldn't believe the kind of things that happened in the 1930s in Ireland. Both North and South, you had two kinds of competing sets of certainties. That they shared that was their kind of their absolutisms, their authoritarianism, and their assumptions about the body, their assumptions about women, men, the assumptions about institutions, their aversion of religion, which had strayed so far from spirituality and so on. So you had this stuff. The point about it is that to do things what I would call the music of the heart or the stuff of the soul doesn't require you to abandon your intellect. But at the same time, intellectual work is work, but it's wonderful work when it is shared. And that's why there is a great excitement. We're back where we started. There's a great excitement in the speech when it goes well. And it isn't a case, I have a poem written about this, when I have seen some fake people at this as well, and they almost stop in the speech to say, I've got them now. This is when you have lodged the good lie. And as Harry Truman said, I'm damned if the truth can ever catch up with a good lie. But you see, the thing about it is this discourse is the thing. And I suppose Habermas is 92 now. Maybe his basic contribution is that people should debate and discuss what you get. You should be bound, both constitutionally and legally, by what you have had the opportunity to discuss and understand. And that's why I say you have to teach these subjects. And let's look at the good news about it all. I don't think in 10 years' time there will be anyone who could say that they could teach economics separately from a consideration of society or without a consideration of ecology. I think I quoted Ian Gough, Heat, Greed and Human Need. But this is the way it is, and I think that's going to be good. I think people making a connection between the agony and the possibility and joy of life and why they're here. Maybe the biggest challenge coming when I'm looking at now in relation to what I'm reading in Europe as well is the effect COVID has had. on people's thinking. Look, only 10 years ago, people were advancing the notion that the small state was good. You wouldn't be able to deal with the pandemic without the state. We rely on the state and public workers, frontline workers, to be able to deal with it. But what were we saying about that before? People were talking about the necessity, that you mentioned Trump, to wither the state, and how, in fact, that the only thing that mattered was strong individualism, and that nobody should stand in anybody's way for getting big. You have the COVID crisis, you have the ecological crisis, you have all of this. So we need to think it out very, very differently. So there'll be a different view of the state. I think there will be a better version of economics. So it's rather like the time when people were bringing into being the welfare state or the National Health Service in Britain, which I regard as one of the great achievements of humanity. And you can, it's all there. And I think I get a sense as well that it's not just young people, but people of all ages will see that where all the different assumptions are up. And none of, by the way, as well in relation to, I don't subscribe to this notion that religion is dead. I think there's a form of spirituality that is going to respect nature. Look, what is the ecological crisis and why do we need the sustainable development goals now? Because of a great violence against nature. There are countries around the world who in their constitution refer to it as Mother Nature, Terra Magna.
You write about COVID almost as a stabilizer, that it has generated a space to reflect.
It has been a great shock to the system. I think that, of course, it's people who have died, the people who are seriously ill, people who have lost loved ones. But there was a moral challenge that it posed as well. We were back to the using words. What do we mean by saying it was a global pandemic? And then we find that we fail to distribute vaccines globally. But more than that as well, we're tested. And here's two tests come immediately to mind. One is TRIPS, where you say to people about it, well, yes, of course, people who invest in science and technology have the right to see the results of that in which they've invested in. But surely when it comes to life and death itself in relation to the very, both responding to, preparing and seeking to avoid and anticipate things like a pandemic, surely that should be universally available, and surely one should allow the technology and science. And I've spoken to Nobel Prize science people who have said that they would love their work to be put into action to enable people to produce all of these things in their countries. That's one. The second one is interesting, which is coming up, and that is now everyone agrees, look, we're in a time when interest rates globally are very, very small. And you could have a chance, I discussed this with the German president, and where you have a chance to say, when you speak about surplus countries like Germany, deficit countries like the Mediterranean economies, you could have a chance to level up the different things, roads, housing, things like that. The next thing is already they're starting, but who will pay for it? So therefore, if you could, for example, start all of this new approach, and you suddenly say, well, you have two treaties then that are in somewhat contradiction to each other. You have the Lisbon Treaty, which spoke about cohesiveness as well as competitiveness. And then you have Maastricht. Maastricht said that you can bring in a set of rules that are almost non-treaty to say you can't do this. And what you discussed with it is, what if you had a huge agreement in the Europe that I'm writing about and that others are writing about, to say this is a chance for us to be really European in terms of sharing things. And suddenly somebody began arguing for a set of fiscal instruments which are derived from the other treaty in many cases, and said you can't do this. Well, what that tells you then is that's something that can't be handled by a council of ministers meeting. But if it isn't handled by those who take the decisions at the highest level, it will be answered very differently in the European street.
But do you think it's realistic that a completely new approach to global economics can be based on the reaction to the pandemic, that it would be used as a template?
I think it created an atmosphere in which people had a chance to think again. Look at where we are. But equally, the climate crisis, what's happening in floods and what's happening in drought, when we see there what is quite, I mean, after Glasgow, one of the things that was striking to me was people who say we'll do this in 10 years' time or 20 years' time or 30 years' time, when a person from one of the island nations was giving his contribution standing with the waves rising around him. And again, this is why there's an urgency. I very much agree with President Robinson in that there's an urgency to all of this that is very important. I've given 2 long answers. Now we must get snappy about it, because so that they will be able to.
We'll move on. In the book, there's a wonderful speech you gave at the Galway Arts Festival that deals with the concept of home. And it resonated with me in the sense that you talked about home beyond simply shelter. And it touched on the emotional elements of what we call home. And it reminded me of a poem you wrote. It came to prominence again during the pandemic. Take Care, it's a beautiful poem. Agus ostra da gula fill in, beidir gur bhaile a léamh mar an cumalat.
It had a whole second coming during COVID, Michael.
Did you enjoy that?
Oh, I did. It was, I know. I'm glad that it. No, it's a nice poem, and there was another poem that was with it. I think it's in my second collection called Beyond the Eye. Yeah, but take care. Okay, I'll read it if you like. I pour some of this water. If the poem has to be respected. Oh yeah, that one is better. And it'll give me a bit of a lift. All right. Take care. In the journey to the light, the dark moments. Sorry, I'll start. Take care. In the journey to the light, the dark moments should not threaten. Belief requires that you hold steady, bend if you will with the wind. The tree is your teacher, roots at once more firm from experience in the soil made fragile. Your gentle dew will come and a stirring of power to go on towards the space of sharing. In the misery of the eye, in rage, it is easy to cry out against all others, but to weaken is to die in the misery of knowing the journey abandoned towards the sharing of all human hope and cries is the loss of all we know of the divine, reclaimed for our shared humanity. Hold firm, take care, come home together.
I ggéisteach leis an ná áirithe sin rud a thug seach an cíine dom hain an nachcainte sin atá againn nar a bhí an techt a bhaile rud. It might be after having a nice meal, or it might be after exerting yourself and you're satisfied and you say tá techt a bhaile and there's coming home in it. And in this particular speech, you talk about the right to a home, the social right to a home. And you say, home is something greater than shelter, not merely any temporary expedient. It is about the acquisition of the means to belong in community and participate without shame.
Well, I gave I was looking for it here. I gave it in Galway, I think, at the
2018,
at the Arts Festival. And I was asked to make a meditation, as it were, on the one word, home. And I did. I took the work of 2 philosophers, Martin Heidegger, who is about building and life, and that's one, and the other one, Bachelard, about 50 years later, where it was about intimacy. And I took this, and you were right to use the word belonging, is that the concept of, there's a huge difference between, if you like, house, that's very much Heidegger, and house, home. Well, Heidegger had the word dwelling, building, dwelling, life, and so forth. In the case of Bachelard, it was about the amount of intimacies that are poured into a space that is shared. And that's very, very important. The word belonging is able to handle these. And what I was very much thinking about was my work I would have known before with migrants and migration. And you were mentioned to me when we were in Ethiopia, and people put up temporary shelters. And poured into these are all of the intimacies of the children, the parent, the rest of it, that as you manage. And as a word you would use there as well, you would use the word flocking, just like birds, and people for warmth and security pressed together. And it is there, in that case, the intimacies that are in a shared space are important. Now, contrast with that as saying is a word that would be in popular usage in the newspapers, the property. The property has come to market. I actually think it is, if I was writing satirically about that, you know, the idea that a place in Aylesbury Road sprouted extra legs and started walking towards the Irish Times, you know. So you didn't look at it, but you're quite right. And when people look at the needs of housing, what people want, no more than the notion of having an address. Long time, you couldn't access many of the basic rights if you didn't have an address, and so no fixed abode and that. So I have to be careful now at this stage because of my constitutional position. But
doesn't bother you?
Oh no, it doesn't keep me awake too often. But the point is, look. I think that first of all, shelter is a right. I think Pádraig Kenna's book on housing, whom I would know Pádraig, and I support it strongly. What people want in a way then in relation to the rental market and other, what people want is the security of a space in which you can achieve belonging. And belonging is a very, very important concept. And then I think as well as that, look at cutting straight to the point as well. I think that when I was a councillor myself, and I was living in 8 local authority estates, I'm in favour strongly of public housing on public land being built by governments.
We've been sleepwalking into a housing crisis, and we appear to be in it at the moment.
Well, a lot of it is the fault. Remember the bubble that we created in relation to this, and a great deal of it, this. When you're 80, like I am now, and I look back at all the different categories of thought, and that what crept into the worst part, I think, of the accumulated kind of economics people were speaking was that it became insatiable. And that's why philosophy is so important, is people should debate what is sufficient, what is necessary, and what is insatiable, and what is endless accumulation, and so on. And you see, this is the other side of it, is that I like to you have to put yourself into the wound of the contemporary to understand it. That's what dramatists do. That's what Ibsen did in his powerful work. And you have to be able to live in the wound of the world, and what's really quite hopeless is when people live by abstractions, like people you speak about, for example, huge speculative ventures. I remember saying, did you get a bit of that? As if they were talking about a pie. And then economics was being taught in the university. I remember a collaborator with Howard Stein, University of Michigan. We were discussing a survey across North America where the history of economics wasn't taught in any place up more than 12%. And the idea that you have like single trick ponies where people, in many cases, like for example, intellectually, let's take it, I'll get blunt about this now and say that econometrics, for example, is a set of instruments which are very valuable, but they're not a method in the fullest sense, and they're certainly not a theory, and they don't come near like being a social policy. And this is the difference where we're going to be teaching things differently, be teaching different subjects together that are able to engage, as it were, with what is the wound of the world at the time and its possibilities, rather than living by abstractions and seeking then, if in fact actually we have a veneer of cover for it, of insisting that the rest of the world must copy it. This was why I suppose in some of my more recent speeches I've been saying is that when we're all critiquing how we come to have all the assumptions we hold in our head, some of the most difficult things to do are people who have lived by imperialist assumptions. That mind doesn't go for generations. It's still a view of some people as being superior, and look, it's all around us, look how we're looking at this, and then other people are inferior. And some brilliant scholars can in fact fall into that. I was looking the other day at some of Lecky's work, the historian, and in his notion, not too far off Hume's assumptions in many cases. The Irish were never conquered by the Romans, so they don't have that civility, so therefore they fall back regularly on their barbarism, and you don't know when it's going to break out.
Thank God bless the barbarism. You talk about experiencing the wounds and feeling those wounds. Currently, you have so many people waiting on housing lists. You have young couples who can't afford to enter the property market, even with significant resources behind them.
It would be better to describe them as young people who should be housed.
An soha gur coghine, tá fáib tSíthigh de Savédis gohfuil éilehar hihansa áit anna yasa shahi chun techt chun cónahan ach ní se dacfannig a daoine óga tithe a chnach ina geantar féin mar tá na praisna mitheróard. Cunas mar a raibh for inglecla sin?
Well, tá daoine ferrig na tá aifab seo faoi aspatíocht tá se ghuilintar fud an tíre, it's cuma cáhat an bhfuil tú. Ní bhaint na ach in áiticha ar gúlta tá daoine. Agus rud eile tá tábhachtach, which is very interesting. I'll go barely better. But one of the things that was most I was giving a paper recently about migration. And it was a very interesting challenge about after the foundation of the state. What did people do? The people who left the National Army. My uncle was in the National Army from 1922 to 1927. My father was in Tin Town 3, and he was what you would call one of the regulars. Now, I was looking for something I was writing at the experience of these people. And Kerry is very interesting in this in many ways, because many of the people who were on that side of the argument, that is what you would say who might have been intent, about 40% of them emigrated. But what had happened in the meantime? Joe Lee had a phrase that just stick with me for a long time. It's not something, it's a real problem. And that was pre-famine. He said the fields gave way to families. People got married young and they set up barns and corners of fields and so forth. And he said after the famine and the adjustment in land title, families gave way to fields. You have one person inheriting, you have another person marrying in, you have another person going out. So what were the rest to do? They had to travel and so forth. And then you had people who were entering the trades. And these are the kind of things in history that people perhaps haven't been debated enough.
You're a great believer in history informing future action.
Oh, absolutely. Like, say for example, after the 1922-23, in 1924, 1923, Seán Moylan is writing to De Valera, saying to him that he should try and stop the IRA ban on the migrants who had no permit, the immigrants who had no permits from the IRA being allowed to join Clan and Rail. People said it was regarded as unpatriotic. But you're only going to get one person as a proprietor on the farm. You could have women, for example, they would stay on as relatives assisting. And you'd have others and say, well, what were they to do? So suddenly in many cases, this is the way it was. And the message that time was, you got a permit from the IRA to go to America, and you gave good reasons. Some people would give health reasons. But if you didn't have the permit, and people in Kerry, many of them didn't, and they went, and they weren't allowed to join Clan and Gael, which meant that they weren't able, for example, to take advantage of the networks for employment, friendship, and other things like that. Then in 1925, it changes, and it said they can become a reserve kind of force in the argument about biometric. But what you have to think about this is that it's a big moral achievement, and you're right about housing. It's a big moral achievement when people operate and think collectively and take the needs of it. Now, let's get positive about a lot of it. Yes, during the recent pandemic, you saw wonderful aspects of people expressing the best of themselves because they were identifying with the vulnerability of other people. But to say that is one thing, but to see it in the main subjects as they are taught, or the policies that will in turn be based on versions of economics or of society or of ecology. I think the one thing I have to, where I'm very, very much interested in many ways, is that if you were at 80 years of age like me, and part of this, that you need people a lot younger to just tell you beautiful prospects of how the world is going to change. But I'm just saying about it, there's a lot of work to be done.
You mentioned the Civil War there, Uachtaráin, and I'm just wondering, you know, as we approach the commemoration of the Civil War, that's going to be a significant challenge.
Oh, I think it will be, but we have to be honest about it. In my own case, my father was from a family of 10. His father, there were 7 of them, and 5 of them emigrated to Australia between 1852 and 1860. And when my grandfather died, and shortly after the birth of my father, some of the Australian relatives sent home £100 to her, but she had 10 children. Now, they were all involved in different ways in the War of Independence as it happened. My father was an apprentice to bar and grocery, and then he went on to so forth, and he was a traveller for a company, and then he was in the Cork number to Charleville, North Cork. That's how he knew John Moylan, but he spent time in 10 Town 3. But when he came out, nobody would down in County Clare. Nobody would speak to him after Mass, and his name kept being handed in as the person responsible for land agitation. There was more than 250,000 acres still to be divided of the estates after the Civil War, and there was an awful lot of it with people with their eye on a piece of land. Then my uncle, who reared me for nearly 10 years, a man I loved, and as with my aunt, father and others. He had been in the East Clare Brigade, and he was in Renmore for the handing over of Renmore, and he was in the National Army from 1920 to 1927 and went home. But what about all the others? The others were trying to make their living in different ways. I had an aunt who was a nurse in Cairo, and she had joined with the British forces in Palestine during the administration there. I had ones who trained in different ways to try and make a living. And that's why it's important that we understand it. And my work on that, which I will do next week, I think, when I'm coming back to do the mountain thing, is to try and see it from below. People trying to make a fist of their life. But you see how, for example, when I say that how land becomes the basis of everything, and land then will become, I think too, the people will get more acres and so forth. I'd need a whole fortnight to tell you about what I've written about the graziers, because you must remember the graziers were a native landowner movement effectively, but I think that what would happen after that, I'll be blunt, as a poet, I would say as well, I often think back to people rather like in Thomas Hardy's sense, the people are close to the land, people know the intimacies of fields and animals and others, things like that. But there's no room for them, except as in a secondary status, other than the person who is the proprietor. So they have all of that sensibility too. They immigrate. And in 1901, of all the people born on the island of Ireland, the majority are living outside the island of Ireland. Now, that has huge repercussions. And then they will in turn, there's one very interesting thing that I think in 1860, the Times in London, which had argued against any relief for the famine in 1847, says they have gone abroad and they will multiply. They will no longer be confined between the Shannon and the Corrib, and they have joined one of the most significant and powerful states, and they will never let us forget it. And then you've got a whole series of different versions in the diaspora. But you see, when you say to me about it in a way, when you do acts of commemoration, what you have to do is you have to try and put everyone into it. I'll answer a question that I will be asked, no doubt, in the commemoration. Did my father and my uncle, for example, reconcile against this? The answer is no. And I also met many people who were in similar circumstances and whatever. Rather like this notion of handing the person's name in as the person responds. It wasn't my uncle who did that, but others did, because at this stage, the next big thing after the land is respectability. Respectability. And if you add in for the fact then about it is the lovely, even the church gets involved in many cases about getting someone to be ordained for the diocese now, not the missions. It's all very fine for God, as everyone knows, only calls on the Christian Brother schools for the missions and the rest of it. And as somebody once wrote in a book, he said, an interview with Maynooth, they like looking up to us Maynooth men. So you this, and yet then in all of them, after spending a half of my life as a teacher and researcher and the rest of it, you find an extraordinary inability in Ireland to discuss issues of class and the false notions people have about it. Yeah. I'd better get not carried away.
To the speeches. You're regarded as a very outspoken president, and it came to prominence again there recently with the issue over the event commemorating partition. The constitutional constraints, do you find them challenging, or do you tend to push the line, like I've heard you enter debate in relation to salaries in the defence forces, direct provision in this country. You've been very critical of it, quite openly. Do you like pushing the line on it?
No, it isn't a matter of pushing the line. You see, I had a great advantage in a way, apart from the fact that I had been elected at every level, local level. I had been a TD, I'd been a senator, I'd been a minister, I'd been the other things. But I'd also been teaching political science for a very, very long time. And I know the Constitution. And for example, I don't ever speak about any legislation that is before the Dáil or the Seán, that part of the Oireachtas, because I am part of the Oireachtas. I don't that's their business, and they're dealing, they've been elected, they have a tough time because in a 5-year period you can try and get as much as you can done. But then on the general issues of equality or poverty or neutrality or if other things like that, I feel perfectly entitled. And on the one you mention in many, many cases, there's absolutely nothing at all wrong with people praying together and striking even a penitential note for what they themselves have done to encourage and sustain division. That's all fine. But if you take that and say then this is going to be part of the Northern Ireland Office's celebration of partition, and you're in a different context entirely. And I had to take a difficult decision, and I believe I took the right decision. And I wrote a many. And by the way, I took that decision finally after a lot of consideration on the 13th of March. And then, but still people were assuming in many ways, you know, maybe he'll change his mind. But the fact about it is, I don't, someone said that I put my hand up in the air, how is the wind? I don't operate like that. It is, I'm just around.
Were you expecting the reaction?
I knew there would be somewhat of reaction, but remember, I was in the middle of doing work for the state. I was in Rome. I was meeting the president of Italy. I was meeting 14 presidents or members of the Ariolis group. I was meeting the Food and Agricultural Organization, the World Food Programme. I was meeting the Pope. And I was getting on with all of this, and this little volcano was going off. But no, that's all you do. I'm not infallible, but I do know what I do my best to draw on what is both my experience as the vulnerable person I am and the experience I have accumulated through my life to take what is the best decision. I haven't been in doubt for a second, but it was the correct. And then the other part about it all is that I go to the north all the time. I will be visiting Lagan College because I've been invited with Baroness Blood and myself to talk about the value of integrated education. And I just do that because and incidentally, the other question, if I had in fact actually gone to something that had as its title the partition of Ireland, it's doubtful as to whether it would be constitutional, and it's doubtful as to whether either it would be very helpful in relation to what we all hope to get on with past the Good Friday Agreement.
In the case, when you do intervene on issues such as that one, or let's say...
No, I didn't intervene. Remember what
Well, interject.
Oh, no, I didn't interject either. It's very interesting.
Contribute.
No, it's rather like going to a wedding. I got an invitation, and I decided what I actually said in my personal was that I want to wish you well, but if it is under this title and organized in this way, I must wish you well, but I cannot unfortunately be with you. That's what was said.
The views you've expressed in relation to direct
now, if you
provision.
go to a wedding, it might be different, but you'll still be entitled to say yes or no.
Yes. Direct provision.
Oh, direct provision, yes. I hope the system is replaced, but there's no problem about that. I think it's going to be replaced. And it's... Look, see, the issue there is that I know what all of these people... I had a very, very great friend that I miss very much, and that's Sally O'Neill Sanchez of Trócaire, and that Sally O'Neill and I visited places like the massacre at Sanda, Salvador, Honduras. We were in Somalia during the famine and all of these. And if you have some experience, as you have yourself in many cases, my attitude towards it is when new people arrive, you should try and see what skills they have. You should try and see what skills they have can be advanced. You can see what they want. And there are, look at, that's happening. There are very good people doing very valuable, good things in Ireland as well. But that system was wrong, and the system needs replacement. And I think it's in the process of being replaced. For example, the decision recently in relation to get a driving license, supposing you got a job out of it and so forth, to open a bank account, you didn't have an address. Mind you, on that, by the way, insofar as you're trying to provoke me, but not doing so sufficient, and that is about it. I was saying today to the credit union movement that I was speaking to Cork Credit Fats, and when I was saying about it, just look at the way the banks, who having gathered up the profits of people for generations, are sailing out of towns and closing down branches, and it's a scandal. Yeah. Just disgrace. No more than the assumption is, again, it's in relation to what about the older people in our community, the assumption? Would you like to hear about electronic banking? And it's a good thing, yeah, but it shouldn't be imposed on people. I think there are people who have been meeting people and meeting them. I'll tell you, it's very good that the post office is moving into some of this area anyway. But the idea that, suddenly announcing we're leaving, I think of course, I'm not an actor. I better be careful now. I feel a suggestion coming. No, I feel a suggestion coming on.
COVID-19, do you think it's an opportunity for community to reconnect?
Yes. So I beg your pardon?
The network within community that might have been, I suppose, neglected.
Yeah, I think I just worry about the definitions in a way. Like, ideally, if you ask people, most people would like to be able to stay autonomous for as long as they can, but then people do need care, and that has to be provided and so on. But there is, again, the interest that really back to some of the point I do discuss. The Pope has actually spoken about this, as Pope Francis has, in relation to why should, for example, the degree to which a society is caring for its citizens, or a state caring for its citizens, why should not that be a mark? When you look, for example, at all the indicators of performance, gross national product or gross domestic product, or you take upon this indicator or that, why not in fact have an indicator on care? And if you're doing that in many cases, then you value, for example, the caring professions, care as work. And why should it but you see, in what we have come out of pre-austerity, through austerity, it's the notion that caring was somehow something less sexy in relation to being an occupation to anything else. And yet it is the most important, as we have heard, not just in relation to the pandemic, but in relation to people are different levels of vulnerability. And that is what is very, very interesting about the centenaries when we were discussing about the democratic program of the First Dáil. And you have a motion of providing footwear for children that's defeated very early in the history of the state. And then you come on, and the democratic program is one of 5 principles used as an election tactic by De Valera when he's in 1926. So we didn't see, that's where it is going to go. I think myself that the new form of public policy and economy will go in that direction. And
Tá farsa ar móthir óna séchlog ar maidin agus bailó dhéir níl feicear de hanga. Péisceal go fóil. Tá Ryan Keshtina, a few questions from the audience that were submitted to the committee here. They were handed to me this evening. We'll run through a couple of them, if you don't mind.
Okay, And you will tell them that my book is not sold out yet.
He's a good salesman. And I hear it's just gone into the 3rd print run.
It's in its 3rd print.
Yeah, fantastic. Evelyn asks, you're a passionate author and reader. What advice would you give someone who doesn't read that would encourage them to pick up a book and start reading?
Well, I think one of the greatest advantages, Sabina would be better on this than I, in many cases, is for parents to read with their children. And that's a companionship as well, and it builds a great bond. And the other thing is to read what is curious for you at a time. And the other side about it, one of the things that would help it, there are places around the country that have wells for children, where people read for children, people participate. I know there's a very good one in Ennis, for example, and so on. The libraries are so important. And while it is important that people be able to get their books electronically and all of the rest of it, library staff are important, so that you have people who will encourage people to get it.
Maud asks, we've seen the closure of Chapters Bookshop in Dublin. Yes. It's a real shame. How vital a role do you think bookshops play in our towns and villages in Ireland?
Well, I remember when I was minister in 93, 97, and I was president of the Council of Culture Ministers in 96, and I made the last attempt on the fixed price of the book. I was trying to save the bookshops. Now, it's very good that people can get their books from abroad and all the rest of it, but there is an alliance of independent bookshops, and it should be supported. And people should, if possible, get their book as close to home as possible. I certainly believe that, and I'm strongly supportive of that.
John Frayne asks, where do you see Ireland's role in Europe in the next 10 years as the only English-speaking country within the EU?
Well, it's one of the 2 English-speaking countries. Malta is English-speaking as well, and I'm going to Malta for a state visit the 8th, 9th, and 10th of December, if COVID allows. But the point about it is that no, it is it's a great pity that because the administration in the United Kingdom has left the European Union, doesn't mean that the language of Chaucer and the language of Shakespeare and the poets and the novels of Hardy and all of the others won't still be very important. And we must remember this. Very shortly we'll be celebrating the end of the centenary of the publication of Ulysses and so forth. We have used the English language. You know, we didn't, one of the things is for another day, but it is something that at this stage of my life that bothers me, and one of the reasons I speak Irish nearly every day at some stage to some people, but the idea, it's a horrific thing to quench a language. And then the adjustment to that, where I was talking about when I came at 19 to live in Galway and the rest of it, and I being for the Irish language, and a woman talking to me about how her children needed English and to be able to speak it well, so that they could emigrate and so forth. Chang and Vochtanish was the Irish in many cases. But then we took the English language, and after its imposition for all of these kind of things, the current level of writing, but also the level of people like O'Casey, people like Bacon, people like Joyce and Longley and all these people, they've taken the language and enriched it enormously. And there's no reason why people shouldn't be able to use several languages like that. But every now and again, I do say this, and I believe it very strongly. I don't impose anything on anybody, but I do say there is a long echo of the Irish language. And particularly I say this where I'm speaking, here in this place. And that is how our ancestors breathed, how they drew their breath and made sounds and responded to other sounds and so forth. and made a language and built a mythology too, and built how to entertain, how they did it. They took classical stories from Greece and they put their own versions of them and they shared them, and they took manuscripts and they copied them out. And there was one family in every parish who would actually become known as the parish that had the Sgéileacht as a kind of a repository and so on. That's very important. So I think that the language will survive all the bad politics. So the English language won't be defeated by the bad.
Is tachaí úntachtá ó hebh na teanganda agus ó hebh na Gaeltachta ach an gapan tú bhfuil dóhanna dhéanamh I go bainte seo tá an teanga ar a glún ag iad fárá an déag sruistice sa Gaeltacht. Bhfuil dóhanna dhéanamh chuin cuasaí teanga chuir chun céin?
Well, you know, is sínta chun cuioin ar airig mar hampla le TG ceart television radio na Gaeltacht agus mar sin de. Ach an éire na dála brehan sé na daoine féin, agus brehan sé na daoine féin agus Kamala sin rud é a kind of cahamid a kind of undénachas hógan dar eis san cuioin an with a caran garaig. Tá sport a buint leis, mar hapla na daoine ógam lá clia casam láir when you're being taken kind faoin Gaeilge. That dreadful word, crack, comes in. Tá crack a buint leis, tá sport a buint leis. Tá siad sportú Dingle as umlawn. And that's the thing I mentioned about the deadliness of land and respectability. Maybe the worst side of those who have imperialism and that kind of thing forced on them is the quenching of sensibility. And that's why Joyce's magnificent book is important. It says that, you know, but Stephen, but particularly Molly Bloom, she knows the sensuality of life. And that's what bad abstractions do, is that they block the sensibility of life. And we have to keep that. So, and the Irish language, this is the most interesting thing. It's full of sensuality. I was very sorry to hear my friend Seán Tyrrell dying, who did that wonderful thing, Court and Vanny and the rest of it. And her son Mary McPartlin, who played the part of the Queen. And she pointing out her finger at the men who are failing in their performances.
Tá ceist ó Mario Callaghan son, tá sé freagar hat son agat stálam. An ceist déag beidir, bit of a curveball. This is from Pat Flanagan. The presidential term is 7 years. Do you feel at some point that might be reduced? And if so, what do you see would be the consequence of that change?
I don't think the people are holding their breath on it, frankly. It has been discussed by the Citizens' Assembly, who decided against changing it. There's only one thing I would say about it, because of course I am president. There's only one thing I would say. It would be wrong to have the presidential election at the same time, or to have the same term as the term of government. The independence of the office of the president is incredibly important. It is not there as a contradiction, nor as a hindrance to government, but remember what it is directly elected by all of the people. So whatever you do about the term, the time in it should never be in fact the same as the others, so that you would be able to keep the integrity of the independence of it. And the independence of it has, I hope, been strengthened.
Blessed to have your independent voice. Well, Uachtrain hark cawn na hain a habaile han sonocht baile mawachas gwa lat hain agus Sabine as tachtan ar láhir an óir bhúr don bhéile agus don gaunter. I've been fortunate to travel on a number of trips with you abroad and so on, and I'm always struck by the reception you receive, and in particular the impact of your words. And we're fortunate that we have a president like yourself to represent us on foreign platforms, and the image of the people you carry with you, I think, is so important. But also you're not afraid to challenge aspects of that image. for the betterment of all the citizens in our society.
Well, tá mar bheith bhuite tá sach na duine atá il áras ítach seans na néisio flé go pipe. It's so important that we were able to do it. And let us say as well, let us celebrate the book and the people who make books and the people who read books and the people who care for books and so forth. And it has been a real, real pleasure to be here.
Oh.